Up next is Rob Zuber speaking on microservices. Rob is CTO of CircleCI, and with his keynote on microservices, just another tool in the toolbox, please give a warm welcome to Rob Zuber.
Before COVID-19, when we could actually all meet in person for conferences, I had the opportunity to speak at QCon SF in a track on architecture. I also joined a panel of all of the speakers at the end of the day, and throughout the day I noticed two themes in the questions that were asked, both at the end of each talk and in the panel. First, when should we switch to microservices, or event-driven architecture, or whatever else was on people's mind? And second, how do I convince management? The types of people asking these questions work for me. They may work for you. They may be you. I'm Rob Zuber, CTO of CircleCI, and I want to talk to you today about microservices, but in the context of two bigger points. First, determining the patterns and approaches that are most appropriate for you, your team, your product, and your architecture. And second, how to align your organization around these approaches so no one feels like the only thing standing between them and good architecture is management. At CircleCI, we started on the journey towards microservices in an effort to solve a very specific set of problems. We had operational scaling issues where multiple instances of the same monolith were conflicting with each other, causing challenges as we tried to grow our customer base. So we decided to pull out a small set of services to deploy only a few of certain services while still having hundreds of instances of others. Then, as we started to derive value from these services, we changed our perspective. We said, hey, services are really great and probably we need more of them. So our problems shifted from the specific challenges of scaling that we were facing to a more broad absence of microservices. And I can tell you for a fact, the absence of microservices is not a good problem statement. If you did sort of a 5 whys deep dive, you'd realize that you have real problems you're trying to solve. For example, operational scaling, a real problem that we were trying to deal with at CircleCI. Or maybe your problem is onboarding velocity. Your code base is too complex or there are too many pieces in there and it's difficult for a new engineer to get their head around the entire picture as they are learning how to operate within your environment. Or maybe it's just a risk of change. Every time you try to make a change in your code base, you find that it's tightly intertwined or intermingled and you have unexpected side effects. And that causes overhead in your ability to deliver. Or it could be a risk in deployment. So similarly, you're unable to make effective deployment changes, perhaps because you have unintended side effects, perhaps because you find that there's too many things changing at once because you have all of your pieces together in one. These are real problems. And if you took an 80-20 Pareto approach as you start to dig into those problems, you might find that your biggest problems are solved after you've deployed 2 new services. So you still have your monolith and you've made a couple small changes. And at this point, your problem is no longer the one that you started out with. And you might move on to something else that's more important to solve for the business. And based on the way that we tend to talk about architecture in this industry, many people might say, but wait, that's not a microservices architecture. And the question that I want us all to ask is, who cares? It's your architecture or it's my architecture. It's the architecture that best suits the needs of my business and solves the problems in the most appropriate way. You don't have to have an all-in, everything is one type architecture. What you should have is the architecture that best combines the patterns and approaches that are needed to solve the evolving challenges of your business. And what made sense for you 5 years ago might not make sense for you today. And what makes sense for you today might not make sense for you in 5 years. Do you have to be making complete cutovers at each one of these points? No. It's very, very challenging to do a complete cutover of your entire code base or architecture. What you should be doing is combining whatever is most important at any given time to meet the needs of your business. So your architecture will evolve with the evolving needs of your business. And speaking of evolution, I recently read Building Evolutionary Architectures. I was really excited about this book, but when I finished, I felt a little bit underwhelmed, like a significant opportunity to advance our thinking had been missed. And my primary reason for feeling this way is that they introduce a fundamental concept that in my mind felt like a game changer, and then I think they failed to take it to its full potential. And that concept is the fitness function. For those who don't know, here's the Wikipedia perspective. A fitness function is a particular type of objective function that is used to summarize as a single figure of merit how close a given design solution is to achieving the set aims. Now, I haven't done any genetic programming, but this concept comes initially from genetic programming, genetic algorithms. On the other hand, I did study engineering physics in college, and I wrote a lot of numerical simulations in Fortran, no less, designed to maximize or minimize complex functions. So this specific idea felt brilliant to me as soon as I read it. Unfortunately, in the book, they then take a bit of a left turn and start referring to every unit test as being its own fitness function, breaking down the notion of a single figure of merit. They also state that if you have a microservices architecture, it will be easier to evolve in this way. But the reality of this situation is when I talk to people about microservices, I generally find they're not looking to evolve an existing microservices architecture. They're looking to move from a monolith, most likely, to an existing or to a microservices architecture. And that's the evolution that they're trying to go through. So let's go back and take a look at that fitness function. If you had to define a set of measures to determine whether any particular addition or change to your architecture was moving your architecture in the right direction, how would you know? At CircleCI, we determine this through architectural values. And so we sat down as a team and identified what our architectural values are. And specifically, we came up with these: functionally decoupled, fault-tolerant, operator-friendly, maintainable, and economic. And we found that it was a little difficult for these on their own to really connect with people. So in order to help clarify, we took a page from the Agile Manifesto and created contrasts. And honestly, the Agile Manifesto really is just a page, but we took that model. So we ended up with focusing on systems that are functionally decoupled over easy to initially integrate, fault-tolerant over bug-free, operator-friendly over coder-friendly, maintainable over quick to launch, and economic over interesting. While there is value in the items on the right, we value the items on the left more. Now, it's important to note, these probably aren't your architectural values. They might be, but more likely you're thinking to yourself, my engineering team does great work by focusing on things that are interesting. Or, we don't have product market fit, quick to launch is the only thing that matters to us. And that's okay. Great news, you have that reaction because you actually know what your architectural values are. You feel it as soon as you think about it. But if you haven't already, you should take a minute to write them down. Because the really important question is, does your entire organization understand those values? Do you all have agreement and are you aligned on those architectural values? Because the alternative is that there are folks in your organization who are trying to implement whatever they just read in their last cool blog post that was put up, that maybe was put out by Netflix and has nothing to do with the problems of your organization. Or worse, they're convinced that if they look for a job in the next 2 years and they don't have 2 years of Kubernetes experience, they won't have value in the market. So they're in a rush to deploy Kubernetes in your environment today, whether you need it or not. So first, take a moment and write these down. Your architectural values, not our architectural values. And then have a conversation with your team. Make sure that you're all in alignment. If you're an engineering leader, you want to make sure that you're thinking about this in the same way that folks on your team are. And if you're an engineer in one of those teams, you want to make sure that you have a clear understanding and shared understanding with the team that you're working in to drive that alignment. And at CircleCI, we haven't exactly invested in building a natural language processing engine that looks at design docs, parses out text, and spits out a score based on alignment to our values. However, expressing these values has allowed us to have really strong, centered conversations around those values as we think about the changes that we're designing and whether they are truly going to align with those values. We think of that as fitness to our architectural values. For example, we realized that our original implementation of permissions management was not aligned with our functionally decoupled value. It made sense when we built it, but we had shifted away from something that aligned with our core values, or in fact, our values had shifted based on the scale of our business, and the implementation that aligned initially no longer aligned. And it was out of alignment enough that we wanted to stop and make some investments in truly functionally decoupling that model. Now, in this case, we did end up consolidating some pieces into a service, but the shape of the problem came to us through the discussion of those values. And values are also a useful way to look at something and say, we're making a conscious decision to do something that will drive further away from the ideal, but we understand it, we can justify it now, and we know how we're going to correct it later. So for example, we focus on the value of operator friendly, and that's more important to us than many other SaaS businesses because we also offer an on-prem version of our product. So we have an unbounded number of operators, unlike many SaaS companies who have only operators working within their own organization. And so we need to be cognizant of that. But we made a decision, for example, to deploy Honeycomb to increase observability within our cloud offering, within our SaaS offering. And we didn't have an initial model to make that work for server deploys. But it forced us to have the conversation up front about where that gap would be, have a sense of the design that we were going to implement later, and commit to the full scope of work, even though we could realize the value sooner in our cloud environment with that initial approach. So truly understanding not just what aligns with our values, but when we are making conscious choices to drift away from our values allows us to have very conscious upfront conversations and drive us consistently in the right direction. Whether you're an engineer or an engineering leader, I am sure you've been involved in many conversations, as I have, about technology solutions where it feels like the other person in the conversation isn't really listening. Creating clear alignment in your org about a set of values not only prevents those tech-centered conversations, but it empowers teams to make great decisions that are in line with those values without having to escalate and have complex tech-centered conversations. And speaking of those conversations, let's all be clear that we, the engineering leaders, created this problem. For every single one of those questions that I received on that QCon panel, my answer was some form of, what problem are you trying to solve? When should I switch to microservices? What problem are you trying to solve? When should we switch to an event-driven architecture? What problem are you trying to solve? And trust me, I was not popular, but I've heard things like, well, I would switch to microservices when your organization is 75 people. But there's no viable justification for that statement without a significant amount of additional context. And as engineering leaders and as engineers, the more we let ourselves get sucked into these discussions of technology because that's what we're excited about and that's what's interesting, the more we continue to put our focus there. But if we consistently frame our conversations around the problem that we're trying to solve and we can get agreement on that problem statement, then the solution will make itself evident in a way that it hasn't for us before. I wish you the best of luck in making that change for yourself. Thank you very much.